Hello and welcome to what is the Whatever Follows a Pilot, I suppose, episode 1 of These Football Times' new foray into the world of vlogging, a word Gary, I'm sure, doesn't like very much. This edition, we're going to look at Colombia and its relationship with football, but probably more importantly with its relationship with the World Cup. Usually, we have Gary and Stephen with us, and this is no different. Stephen, how are you?
Very well, thank you, Stu. How's everything your end?
Not too bad, thank you. And it's your birthday today, just quickly, yeah?
It is. I've got to an age now where I tend to forget about it unless reminded. There has been a couple of times over the last few years where it's taken a Facebook notification to kind of like alert me of my own birthday. But the kids were
first world problem that is.
I know, the kids were really enthusiastic for it today, so that was it. It was kind of like, it was breakfast in bed. It was like, no, don't do anything. Yeah, I can get used to birthdays like these.
Nice one. Gary, not your birthday now?
It's not my birthday now, and if Steve's forgetting his birthday as his age, then mine are actually been a long time ago. But yeah, all very good here. Had a lovely, nice, relaxing Sunday. Went down to the beach, nice beachside restaurant, had some grilled sardines and a couple of cold beers, walked back. Lovely Sunday afternoon.
Very nice.
Yeah, I'm again, as always, really happy for you, Gary, in your life. However, back by popular demand, after his after his audio appearance on the podcast, shall we say, Mr. Pete Watson on the Argentina 78 Political Football podcast. Welcome back.
Hey Stu, hi Gary, hi Steve, good to be back. Looking forward to chatting about football again, about Latin American football. All good on a Sunday evening, eh?
Absolutely. Well, because we're doing it like this, obviously there's no real gentle warm-up, so you can kick us off. Football, Colombia, how important is it?
Yeah, pretty important, I think, to give the great understatement. I'm going to start off with a massive understatement. I think one way of looking at football in Colombia is that the government did a survey about this in 2014, just to work out, how much mileage there was in football, how important it was. And it came out in the survey that 94% of Colombians thought football was either really important or very important to their lives. When I was out in Colombia, I did my thesis about football and its political use in Colombia. And literally every single person I asked that question, is football important? And everyone said football is literally the only thing that unites Colombians. I mean, Colombia, we all know it's a country associated with violence, with drugs, but it's such a disunited country. There are so many problems that really pull it apart. And really football, it sounds very simplistic, but it really is true that football is seen as being the one thing that can kind of symbolically bring Colombians together. To the extent that there was this government policy that the survey was for, actually, that was deliberately addressed at kind of trying to solve some of Colombia's core problems of violence and regionalism and, social conflict. And football was seen as the best way of doing it. Okay.
Gary, obviously, we talk a lot on the podcast. We certainly cover Argentina a lot, as we did with Pete, Brazil. Tentatively Uruguay we've covered, certainly in the political World Cup series, but Colombia, they seem to be there and thereabouts, but never seem to me to have the same sort of standing as per Brazil, Argentina and Uruguay, perhaps.
Yeah, I guess that's true. And I think with regards to probably Uruguay, if we forget the first couple of World Cups, when they were sort of world champions, Olympic champions before that, and then world champions for quite a while because it didn't come to the European tournaments. It's mainly Brazil and Argentina people associate with success in the World Cup, certainly of late. But I think what that shouldn't disguise is the passion for football that's felt across Latin America. And Colombia, as I'm sure as Pete explained, is absolutely no different to that. It's a massive thing for a country, and almost because they haven't had the success that others have, perhaps that yearning becomes even greater.
Stephen, it's we talk quite often about football and society, and the impact that both have on each other, and perhaps maybe again Pete might be able to correct it, but to me it seems that Colombia maybe needs football perhaps more than the other South American countries in terms of a distraction from what goes on in Colombian society.
Yeah, I think it's probably fair to say that. I'm sure that every other South American nation, proud football and playing South American nation, would argue otherwise. But I think we've seen with the 2014 World Cup in Brazil that there were other distractions during what was meant to be the biggest party in Brazilian football history. Riots on the streets, protests, and political discord. That not even a World Cup distracted some people away from day-to-day, fights and political needs and arguments to be picked. And yes, I think Colombia. I think it's a massive point that Colombia is just in need of football as a unifying tool.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you, Steve. I think the other thing is that it's one of the things that Colombia needs to try and improve its national image as well. I mean, there are so few countries in the world that have got such a negative reputation. I mean, you think immediately of Colombia, you think of Pablo Escobar, you think of drugs, you think of violence. It's had a civil war for 60 years. It's, for a long time, it had the highest murder rate of any country in the world and exports the most amount of cocaine. It's kind of associated with criminality. So if the football is also needed to show a positive face to the country. I think 2014, for example, you've just mentioned that Colombia team that won the Fair Play Award at that tournament. James Rodriguez, the top goal scorer. I think all of us remember those goal celebrations, the dances that Pablo Armero and the other players led. That was a real kind of image boost for a country that previously, a lot of people only knew for the worst kind of elements.
It's funny, Pete. I mean, you just mentioned the 2014 World Cup, and a story that fascinates me. A part of World Cup history, I suppose, that really interests me, and this is probably because it falls into one of my two favourite World Cups of all time. But the 1986 World Cup in Mexico, originally awarded to Colombia, and obviously eventually it ends up at very relatively short notice being hosted by Mexico. I suppose, but from an academic perspective, a little bit of background, I suppose, as to how Colombia essentially lost a World Cup, if that's the right way to phrase it.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, the fact that it was awarded the World Cup in 1974 was somewhat of a surprise, really. I mean, Colombia, like Gary said, it doesn't have the same kind of football history that Brazil or Uruguay or Argentina do, or even Peru, really. And Chile's hosted the World Cup in '62 as well. Colombia only appeared in the World Cup in 1962, and that was almost a fluke appearance in lots of ways. So it was one of the few countries in Latin America that hadn't hosted it, so it was kind of on the rota. The guy that really pushed for it to be awarded to Colombia was the same guy that was behind the El Dorado period in the kind of late 1940s and 1950s, a guy called Alfonso Senior, who was responsible for starting the influx of some of the greatest Latin American and then European footballers to Colombia at that time in 1948, 1949. Adolfo Pedernera, Alfredo Di Stefano, Nestor Rossi, pretty much the whole of the Uruguayan and Peruvian sides of the 1950s went and played in Colombia. And Alfonso Senior is again the guy who is responsible for putting the idea into Colombians' minds that they could host it. So he introduces the idea to the then president, a guy called Alberto Lleras Camargo. In the next presidency of Misael Borrero Pastrana, they push even further, and actually they're awarded it. But the fact is that the Colombian kind of infrastructure, the Colombian football system just isn't at all ready. I mean, it's got 12 years to get ready. But, this is a country that, it doesn't have railways connecting the country. The main roads are precarious. It's very slow travel. It takes days to get, to many destinations in Colombia. The Football League has struggled with kind of financial kind of brinkmanship since the end of El Dorado. So, Colombia really isn't, the first candidate in terms of just infrastructure or footballing legacy to host kind of the world's greatest event. And I think that, in typical Colombian fashion, Colombia is not known as being a country that does things particularly in an organised fashion. I think that's fair to say. And again, nothing really happened. There is very little progress over the first 4 years of the Misael Pastrana government. Little is done, little of the kind of stadium building or infrastructure happens. It gets to the start of the 1980s and still nothing really has been done. I mean, the only thing that seems to have been done is they've decided on what the mascot would have been, which was a particularly unimaginative black and white football with arms and legs. So, it really must have taken them, 4 or 5 years to come up with that one. So, I mean, that was basically, I mean, I'm slightly exaggerating for comic effect, but it really wasn't that far removed from that kind of level of organisation. Again, Colombia is undergoing an economic crisis at the time. There are lots of problems economically. There is a civil war going on. There are FARC guerrillas in the countryside. Another left-wing political organisation called the M19 have kind of had some very high-profile attacks in urban areas, such as a kind of a heist of the Simon Bolivar sword from a museum. They also held hostages in the Dominican Republic embassy. So Colombia has internal turmoil, and not much money really is given towards thinking about the World Cup. It gets to 1980, moving slightly further along, and the government kind of starts to, I suppose, abdicate responsibility for hosting it, and they create a kind of a separate organization called the Corporación Colombia 86, which is supposed to be funded by some of the major private businesses in Colombia, such as Bavaria, which is a beer company, which went on to actually sponsors the national team now, the Santo Domingo Group. But again, the lack of communication, the lack of will, the lack of organisation really hinders it. And we get to really 1982 with the World Cup in Spain, and there's very little kind of things ready to be in place at that time.
It's funny you come to 82, and Stephen, again, you and I have commented on this. There's sort of signs in the ground, isn't there? Sort of advertising, Colombia 86, and it's, you see it. I think it's on the, I think it might even be in the official FIFA film for the 82 World Cup, and it's all there. And like you say, being awarded it in 74, and you get to 82, and you assume that everything's ready, but on the face of it, clearly they've got a mascot on a post-it, and that's about as far as they've got in it, Stephen.
It is, because, like say, that's the World Cup we grew up on, and these, the images in the stands, it's the Sport Billy signs, and it's Colombia 86, Fujifilm and stuff like that, and the Colombia 86 one's always stuck in my mind. And I've heard great stories about how FIFA were asking the Colombian designation, about the validity of hosting the World Cup, and they're busy handing out the pens embossed with Colombia 86, while saying, well, yeah, the only way we're going to be hosting this World Cup is if it comes back down to a 16-team tournament, knowing damn well that that FIFA aren't going to stand for that. So it was a game of is it, do we jump or are we pushed? I think that's where they got to by 1982. And they're just brazening it out, really.
Gary, again, are we thinking here that this was arguably Colombia's only opportunity, realistically, to host a World Cup?
Well, you have to say in the foreseeable future, yes. The problem is, I guess the problem is sort of Colombia as well, but it's also the fact that the World Cup just went, as well as the amount of teams competing, and also the infrastructure necessary, and as Pete's mentioned, Colombia just hadn't got it, wasn't even close, and we're never going to be close, no matter how long again. That's 12 years or so. So I think there was a palpable mismatch there between what FIFA expected and what FIFA should have reasonably expected, and it's short-sighted. Don't even do it.
That's so true. The details are quite something. The details of what FIFA asked for, because FIFA start panicking, and I've got the details of what are some of the things they asked for. Because it was going to go to a 2014 World Cup, which made it even harder for Colombia to host it. But they're asking for, FIFA asked for 12 stadiums with a minimum capacity of 40,000 people, 4 stadiums with a minimum capacity of 60,000 people, 2 stadiums with a capacity of 80,000 people. And then they're asking for a fleet of limousines to FIFA officials, network of trains that will communicate all the venues, airports with capacity for jet aircraft. But I mean, just to give you an idea of where Colombia is now, Colombia has one football stadium at the moment that has a capacity of over 50,000. And that's the Deportivo Cali one. There's only one. There are 5 that are over 40, and then there's only 2 over 30. So even now, kind of what we're talking 35 years later nearly, Colombia still wouldn't have the infrastructure. The railways, let's not even talk about it. It's impossible with the Andes, the jungles, the plains, I mean, during the rainy season, there are kind of landslides in Colombia that often stop some of the main roads for days on end. So, I mean, a lot of Colombians see these demands by FIFA as being an incredibly unreasonable demand that FIFA knew Colombia wouldn't be able to do. And Colombians see it as FIFA deliberately making it impossible for Colombia to hold the World Cup because they didn't want to hold it in Colombia anymore. I mean, obviously Colombia did nothing anyway, but...
Do you think, Gary, I mean, I want to say not an abdication of responsibility by Havelange and FIFA, but, Pete's mentioned there this these unrealistic expectations. FIFA as a governing body ultimately is there to protect the game, develop the game, and grow the game as its current statement. And do you think really there was an abdication of responsibility there by FIFA?
Yes, I guess, I'm not sure the responsibility is the right word. I think FIFA's mandate, I think those things you said, it's to make money. Let's be honest about it, espouse all the life, but we all know what, the driving force is. I think it was a case where they were almost ticking the box. Okay, we've got to give it to Colombia sometime, so let's tick the box. If they fall down, and we can go somewhere else. And the fact that Mexico was chosen to take over very, very quickly suggested that it wasn't exactly a major surprise. That Colombia couldn't do it. And as I say, as Pete mentioned, Brazil have had it, Uruguay have had it, Argentina, even Chile have had it. So of the other countries around the area with a reasonable chance, realistic chance, not even realistic chance, but a reasonable chance of making it work. They were probably the last one, because you see countries like Bolivia, Ecuador, it's just not feasible. So they almost got to do it, and that's pendulum swing again, unless you go back to one of the South American countries. But it was a case where I'm sure that when they, even when Stevie explained there about Rouse and when we moved to Havelange, even when it was Rouse's World Cup, it would still have been a massive ask. That it was like a situation where you wanted somebody said, you got this reserve player who wants to play in the first team. He's bloody rubbish. When you get bored of saying, "No, I'll put you in next." You put him in. Have a failure, score 300 goals. Just stop asking them. It's almost a bit like that. You know what I mean? The club's in metaphor, but you probably get the point.
Good analogy, Gary. Excellent. Pete, I suppose coming back to you then, sort of the almost having the World Cup removed voluntarily, abdication, however you want to word it, phrase it. I suppose 2 questions here. Does that increase the inferiority complex of Colombia alongside Brazil, Argentina and Uruguay? And secondly, I suppose the immediate impact on Colombian football. Obviously they're there at 1990, and there's impact there in the 90 World Cup and the 94 World Cup as well from a playing perspective. But I suppose, immediately the embarrassment, if you like, international embarrassment, and having that World Cup withdrawn, what are the relatively short and medium-term effects of that on Colombian football?
Yeah. So I think that, the one thing that Colombia did do at least is that they, it wasn't, eventually taken away from them. They got to actually give it up first. The president, Belisario Betancourt, he does it's quite famous. People actually counted the words of the statement. It's kind of a 99-word statement where Betancourt went on TV, I think it was November 1982, and actually renounced the rights. He actually gave it up. So at least they gave it up themselves. And he said, it's not fulfilling what it should do for Colombia. The World Cup is not going to benefit us, and our money can go to hospitals and education. And a lot of Colombian journalists will point and say, well, where are the hospitals and schools that were supposed to be built then? In terms of that, though, so you have this kind of cloud hangs over Colombia. It's another failure. And again, one of the problems that Colombia has, and one of the reasons why football can be so important, is that, Colombia doesn't have many reasons to be proud of itself. It doesn't have a history of winning wars. we've already talked about the image of the country. So the chance to hold the World Cup would have been something for the country to be proud of. And many people still think we might not have been able to get the stadiums, but it might have given us something to be proud of. In terms of the kind of next kind of 10 years, I mean, I think what you get with this embarrassment is that you get, in some ways, a refocusing of the fact that football can be something. But unfortunately, it's not really a football that's built on a country getting itself together to build its sporting infrastructure. It's not the governing bodies that are doing it. Unfortunately, and this is one of the things that's been very well documented about Colombian football, it's the result of drug money, that goes into the big clubs in Cali and Medellin and in Bogota. And it's probably from there, where we suddenly get a second influx of lots of quality foreign players in the early 80s, coming into clubs like Millonarios, like Santa Fe, like América de Cali, that we start getting a second generation of great Colombian football. And then we start getting the likes of, Valderrama, El Tren Valencia, Faustino Asprilla, that kind of 1990-94 generation start emerging from there. So, but it's not kind of the shame of losing the World Cup. There is a little bit of that, but there's like a kind of, it coincides with drug money that brings, more money into football and then starts expanding from that kind of period.
Stephen, I suppose it's, as Pete's mentioned, we'll probably touch on this as well before we have a chance to finish, but there is that inextricable link between, Pete mentioned about it, between football and corruption, organised crime, drugs. It just seems to have followed Colombian football, and obviously Faustino Asprilla, he plays in Newcastle, but there's always spurious rumours, shall we say. Obviously, I don't want to be quoted on anything, he'll not be libelous for anything, but there's rumours that sort of followed him to up to Newcastle with regards to his extracurricular activities and so on. It just seems to be forever tied. The two seem to be tied together.
Yeah, it's one of those where it just always seems like something is, there's a sleight of hand, there's a bit of puppetry going on. There's always a bit of a side story going alongside the football, and it offers a certain intrigue and a certain suspicion, I suppose, to Colombian football and Colombia as a nation in general. That those on the outside looking in, it's a fascinating thing, but also a precarious subject.
Stephen, Gary, for you, I'm not saying is Colombian football believable. I don't mean that for a minute. But do you sort of get the impression that there is always a tinge of how much can I rely and trust in Colombian football? Should we say?
I guess there's that perception, and people in Europe will probably have a detached view of Colombian football. We don't know a great deal about it because it's not particularly publicised over here. Perhaps Brazilians and perhaps Argentina. Pete's mentioned a few club names there, and I bet a lot of people listening won't know who these clubs are, but as you know, Flamengo, Santos, Boca Juniors. So I think there's that sort of translation that you don't get from Colombian football, and that might be because of the lack of success in the international tournaments. I mean, I don't know, but it may be. But there is always this tainted image of the drug money financing how the football's developed there, and obviously it's difficult to tease these two things apart, especially. And there's I should say famous, literally infamous issue with Andres Escobar. Scored an own goal in the USA World Cup '94, and I don't know, it's months later. I'm sure Pete will give us the details. He was shot apparently because it cost a drug cartel a lot of money in gambling when Colombia didn't qualify. And it's those sort of things, I guess, are what people know because it's what we hear. That's what's news. And Colombian football, and the success of Colombian club football in South American tournaments isn't that well registered. It's not broadcasted. So unless you've got somebody like Pete, an expert on the subject, people just don't know. So there is that mystique about it, and with that mystique comes lack of understanding. With lack of understanding comes a little bit of trepidation as well.
Yeah, I was you say perhaps stereotypical ignorance as well. And coming to you, Pete, I suppose before we finish, just a little bit really on this association, you know, as Gary's mentioned there, going from 94, not so much from 94 up to present day, but, you know, does that association, does that link still exist in Colombian football? Does Colombian football have a brighter future?
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that the cloud exists, and it really starts in '84. You know, I mean, I think that you've got so many clubs that are linked to drug money and drug, you know, and it's proved. You know, I mean, we looked to 1984, and one of the sporting directors of Atlético Nacional, which is one of the big clubs in Medellin in Colombia. You know, they won the Copa Libertadores, the first Colombian club to do so in '89. Their sport director was extradited to the US on drug charges. He was one of the first people to be extradited from Colombia. You know, the America team of the 80s and 90s is linked to the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers, you know, the kind of Narcos Series 3 focus. Deportivo Independiente Medellin Nacional are very closely linked to Pablo Escobar. Santa Fe are linked with a guy called Fano Arizabaleta. Union Magdalena are still linked with a guy that I think is still in drug charges, you know. So this is the problem. It's quite wide-ranging, quite well spread. There is a kind of a drop-off, you know. I think that after the Andres Escobar murder, you know, there is a kind of a tightening of the restrictions, a closer inspection of the Colombian clubs, but it does take a long time to clean a lot of them up. The Clinton list, you know, the Bill Clinton, his administration tried to put a kind of a financial kind of noose around any businesses that had any link with drug money at all. And one of the major companies that suffered with this was América de Cali, you know, this one of the great football teams in Colombia, who couldn't sign anyone. They couldn't, you know, they were struggling to attract sponsors because they were on the Clinton list. They were associated with drug trafficking. They went down to the second division, which was kind of unheard of. Another club called Envigado, which is a very minor club in Medellin, had the same problem. They were on the Clinton list. And quite a few of the clubs in the late 90s and early 2000s were associated with paramilitaries who were also kind of part of a different element of the drug trafficking, drug money laundering kind of view. But they were mostly kind of second division clubs. It seems like, touch wood, that a lot of those links have been removed from the game. There was a law that the government passed in 2011 to try and clean this up. And to be honest, really, since it's just been stories of individual footballers who have had, you know, these links with drug cartels. I mean, you know, the most famous one, you've got Higuita, who was linked to a kind of a kidnapping situation. But even very recently, a guy, you know, you might remember John Villafara, who played for Portsmouth and Southampton, was recently extradited to the US on drug trafficking charges. So there are a lot of players who've unfortunately slipped from the professional game into actually being involved with drug trafficking. There was another guy in the 1990 World Cup, Diego Leon Osorio, who was arrested for smuggling drugs onto a plane. And a lot of footballers have been kind of assassinated in kind of drug-related or crime-related violence as well. I mean, a lot of it is because of the reputation of Colombia. A lot of it still has that, but I think the situation is a lot better. I think Colombian football is a lot cleaner, and you probably can see that because they're not actually very successful, because there's not a lot of money being generated in Colombian football, and they're not doing that well, and that probably says it's cleaner than it has been for a while.
That's quite a sad indictment to finish with.
It probably is, yeah.
Stephen, there's still just quickly, there is still a romantic notion, though, isn't there, about that corruptible South American, international, unknown football, isn't there?
Oh yeah, definitely. It's that subterfuge, isn't it? It's that, you know, you're looking for, you know, it's like the Iron Curtain. You know, it's exactly the same type of thing. There remains a fascination of what's behind, you know, the front of shop, what's going on behind the scenes, and a place like Colombia ticks every single box in that respect.
Gary, you know, final thought from you, I suppose. You know, on Colombian football, I don't want to call them the great underachievers, but I think, you know, I suppose as we started that, you know, that living in the shadow of the other South American giants, it seems, again, as you mentioned, with hosting the World Cup, it seems that they're going to stay in that shadow for quite a while, doesn't it? Unfortunately.
Yeah, I guess, you know, success breeds success, doesn't it? And the big players that come across from Argentina and Brazil, there tends to be less coming across from Colombia. Obviously, there are some, but they're less and less. And it's a little bit sad, as Pete was saying there, that the success or lack of success now is perhaps an indication that it's becoming a cleaner sport. And it's almost, I suppose, finding its true, untainted money level. But they will always be in the shadow of Argentina and Brazil unless something drastic happens. And, I just don't see anything drastic happening to make that change in the foreseeable future.
It is.
But it's always got that mystique about it, Colombian football. As Stevie mentioned, I think it's the great unknown as well. So there's something a bit different. You see, like Asprilla and René Higuita, the Scorpion kick. There's always something a little bit magical about it.
It is, and it's such a shame that we talk about football being sanitized and corporate and capitalist, and luckily for us, the Colombians seem to be resisting. Although, as Pete mentioned, it just means they're not as successful, but that's okay. Guys, obviously, we're starting this, we're doing this. Obviously, the sad part is it lasts nowhere near as long as a podcast. But Gary, thank you ever so much.
Yeah, always happy to talk about football on a Sunday evening with a glass of beer and my mates.
Stephen, enjoy the rest of your birthday. Just don't forget.
I certainly will. A joy as always, Stu.
Excellent. And Pete, as always, your knowledge is wonderful. Clearly, we need to work out a longer time scale for this, so we can truly investigate South American football properly.
Yeah, got 300 pages of the thesis we can talk about, Stu, whenever you want. So, yeah.
I might have to upgrade my Zoom membership for that, I think. But other than that, happy to go.
Yeah.
Guys, like I said, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you ever so much, and hopefully we'll all do it again soon.
Brilliant.
See you later. Cheers.